go ahead and talk about what role species play in ecosystems. So I know we've kind of covered this in some of the labs, but I wanted to make sure that this is something you're aware of, that you need to know, this concept of niche, and generalist and specialist. This was covered in our interactions lab. And so it's nothing new, but just understand that when we talk about a generalist, they have a broad niche and a wide range of tolerance. And so we're looking at a couple of different ideas to focus in on. And a specialist has a narrow niche and a very narrow range of tolerance. And so that is why, like, they're more susceptible to changes in pressures. This is showing kind of, if you think of resource use as the amount of energy, the amount of space, almost like if you could take all of those things and blend them together and turn them into something quantitative, that would be resource use. And a generalist has this resource capacity that is much broader and will, require. It can require more energy, it can require more space, and it can affect more organisms. Whereas the specialist is a really narrow. So the more individuals are there, it's only going to really affect the resources that it's limited to. See if I can do this correct. All right. Within ecosystems, I'm so sorry about the cough, it's still rolling. Within ecosystems, we have four major roles. Native species normally are going to thrive in a particular ecosystem, and that is one of the roles. Those that are endemic, they're native to that ecosystem. And then non-native species, these are species that migrate there or are accidentally introduced into an ecosystem. Non-native may or may not disrupt the ecosystem. Obviously, there's going to be some adjustment in terms of resource use, but it doesn't necessarily mean that that organism is automatically going to become invasive. Indicator species provide early warnings of environmental change. So we look at this. This is like a definition that we give as ecologists. We give to species. Indicator species are those that are going to provide kind of like their behavior or what is happening to the ecosystem shows up in them first. And so lichens are indicator species, amphibians are indicator species, insects are indicator species. These are going to even the population may be an indicator of how that ecosystem is faring. Keystone species have a large effect on the types and the abundance of other species, meaning that this ecosystem, if keystone species is not present, it is likely that the ecosystem will break down. In the book, a case study that we want you to be familiar with is on the American alligator. An alligator is a keystone species in its ecosystem, which is a subtropical wetland. They dig holes, and those holes will hold fresh water and serve as a refuge for aquatic life. So there's a protective capacity. It creates all these smaller habitats for organisms. In the 1930s, they were hunted for sport, for meat, and for their skins. Alligator skin purses, alligator skin wallets, alligator skin cowboy hats. They were quite the sensation. We love alligators in the United States, especially in the South. In 1967, they were added to the endangered species list. And then in the 1970s, they had a very impressive comeback. There are more than 1 million alligators today in Florida. And actually, if you live in Florida and you're near a waterway, you have to be careful. You have to watch out for your dog. And I know it sounds really crazy and small children, but alligators are dangerous. But that is their territory. It is, and they're an important part of keeping that ecosystem healthy. So here's a picture of an American alligator. If you've ever traveled to the South, it is quite the sensation. I think they're really cool animals, but they're aggressive hunters, but they provide a service that no other organism is going to fulfill. Their niche is specific, and they create habitat within the ecosystem. So they are keystone because they are ecosystem engineers, basically. All right, moving into 4.4. How does Earth's life change over time? This is our topic kind of today that we finished up talking about, but biological evolution. We're not done talking about it, but building your understanding of evolution is going to take time. Okay, so Earth's life forms change genetically over time. That is a widely accepted scientific theory, and I know that sometimes there is a little bit of contention over learning about evolution if it feels like it goes against principles that you were raised with. But I'm willing to have a conversation with you over what this means to me personally. It's not something I, talk about like in the classroom, but I'll just mention that I would love to have a conversation with you, one-on-one, if this is something that is hard for you to talk about just because of your own personal beliefs. But change happens in species through what is called natural selection. This is one of the mechanisms of evolution. This is a process where the ecosystem itself selects for what is the best fit in terms of traits. So we used the anoles as the example to show you how natural selection actually takes place. So like when the anoles went onto the new small island, the fact that there weren't any large trees for the long-limbed anoles to climb up meant that they had to survive on smaller branches. And so the system itself, the ecosystem itself, selected for the survival of lizards and the thriving of lizards, which means that they may mate more often, that had the shorter limbs. This is a process by which species have evolved from earlier species. So we see changes, and it's like one small change, one small change, one small change, one small change. Well, when you go back to the very beginning, the changes have accumulated, and there's been big changes over time. We know this because we can see evidence of change in fossils. We have past evidence in fossil beds, and they can be preserved in sedimentary rock, in ice, in amber, which is like sap from trees. And we can look at how organisms' traits have changed over time. Sometimes we can get a little bit of DNA and we can actually sequence chunks of DNA and see how not only has the morphology of an organism changed, but the genetics have changed over time. The fossil record, we refer to the fossil record as the entire body of fossil evidence. It is uneven, it is incomplete. There are times when a lot of fossils are created, and then there's a lot of time periods when there aren't fossils, and we don't know exactly what was happening during that time. The only thing we can figure is like, well, in this time period, organisms look like this. It's indicative of this kind of climate. It's obviously changed over time. There's got to be some gap in between, right? We estimate that the fossils found so far only represent about 1% of the species that have ever lived. So most organisms do not turn into fossils. Excuse me. So this is like an organism from a precursor, also like an ancestor of a horse, and you can actually see that there's a fish there too. So it must have been, I don't know, killed in some kind of water, like, and sunk to the bottom, and then was covered with sediment and buried over time. It could have been, in a storm or something where there's a quick burial, and then there was a lack of oxygen, and so there wasn't the same kind of rate of decay, and then that compression of that body turned it into a fossil. Compression, and it's a replacement of, like, instead of, fluid in the cells, those fill up with minerals, and so it basically turns into a rock. Kind of cool. Evolution depends on genetic variability. So what we're talking about today was like what causes these changes in a gene. We refer to those as mutations. Change in the genetic code does happen naturally. It is a mutation. Mutations are not always bad. Mutations bring variability. That means there's more traits. Darwin, so Charles Darwin and then Wallace independently proposed this concept of natural selection in the 1850s. So Darwin wasn't the only one working on this idea. Genetic variability occurs through random changes in DNA, and it has to happen in the sex cells of an organism in order for it to be passed on to the next trait. organism. It can't just happen, like, it can't just be a mutation that happens here, like after my body has been developed, and then I just get a mutation in my wrist, and then that doesn't just magically transfer to offspring I've already had. The mutation has to happen either in the fetal process. So, like when I'm developing, there's a mutation that shows up in that process, and then is pervasive throughout my body, and then I'm able to pass that on to the next generation, or it happens once an organism is developed, but it would have to happen in the sex cells. Both of those happen. It occurs. Natural selection, we talked about this already, but it's the environmental conditions are going to create pressure for a particular trait to be advantageous. An adaptive trait improves the ability of an organism to survive, and it means that if they're surviving, they're thriving, they may reproduce at a higher rate than the other individuals in their population, given whatever the environmental conditions are at the time. Genetic resistance is an example of natural selection at work. So when we talk about like these different principles, it's always nice to have an example to kind of go back onto. This occurs when organisms have genes that can tolerate a chemical that's been designed to kill them. So we see genetic resistance happening in agriculture when we use insecticides to ward off particular types of pests from crops. And then over time, those organisms we have seen time and time again develop resistance to that particular chemical. Some disease-causing bacteria have developed resistance to antibacterial drugs, which is why you're supposed to take all of your antibiotics, because some resistant bacteria need to be in the condition of the antibiotics for a longer period because they're resistant. It's not proof, like they're not like antibiotic proof, but they are antibiotic resistant. And so they'll last longer. And so you have to take a full course of antibiotics, or you end up with the stronger bacteria, and then you have to get a stronger antibiotic to kill it. All right. So this is an example of that genetic variability where you can see like a bacterial sample. We have normal bacterium that are represented in blue and resistant bacteria represented in red. And you can see that this in B would represent like being treated with an antibiotic, right? It kills most of the bacteria, but not all. But then you have a shift. This is what we refer to as a bottleneck incident. And this bottleneck creates an advantage where now you have two populations, and one of those populations has an advantage, and it's going to reproduce. It can reproduce faster than the antibiotic that's being killed off. So there's another dose, and then you lose one more, and then some out competing for the resources that are there until the colony that now is present is the resistant bacterium. Patterns of evolution can be traced and compared using a phylogenetic tree or evolutionary tree, which we learned about. So I'm just going to let you know that's a tool that we use to trace out how organisms have diverged over time. This one is kind of like the big picture, right? So you can see at the very bottom, we have prokaryotic organisms. Bacteria and archaebacteria are kind of the first two that show up that we see in fossil records. And then from here, this, what does it say? Protocells. Okay. From here, there is development that happens, and protists are thought to develop first, like single-celled organisms, and then from there we begin to see divergence in genetic coding. So this is not just based on body type or traits along the way. This is really based on the genetic coding that we've been able to actually sequence, so pull apart and sequence the genetic code of organisms, to see that the animal kingdom is more closely related. All the animals are more closely related to one another than plants, and all the plants are more closely related to one another than fungi, and that we have some distinct kingdoms that have arisen from the same cellular ancestors, from the beginning of time. Okay, adaptive genetic traits have to precede change in the environmental conditions, meaning, oh, I'm sorry, these are some of the limits to adaptation through natural selection. Okay, so natural selection, it's not magic. There are some mechanisms to it that have to be present. Genetic traits have to show up first in order for the ecosystem to select for or against them. Okay, sorry, I had a student knock at the door, so I paused it. And so, like I was saying, some of the limits are that genetic variation has to be present. Mutations have to happen first, and then a population's reproductive capacity can also limit that natural selection through, or whether it's an adaptation or not, or whether it's even going to stick around. So, like we talked about R and K selected species, depending on how often an organism is reproducing. So we're not going to see changes happen in organisms like elephants as quickly as we're going to see changes happen in bacteria. Like there's just no way. It's because the reproductive rate is happening so quickly with bacteria. And elephants have been around, they're ancient bodies. They've been around for a long time. And genetic traits don't show up as mutations, as adaptations very often. One, because they're already sitting on top of the game and there hasn't been a lot of pressure on them to change. Two, their reproductive strategy is slow. Okay, so species that reproduce rapidly and in large numbers are going to be quicker to adapt. 5 common myths on evolution through natural selection. Survival of the fittest means survival of the strongest. Not true. It means how fit it is to the ecosystem itself. Evolution explains the origins of life. We don't even understand, like, we just barely tapping into this one. It is an incredible force of life, like this creative capacity that evolution could produce you and me. What? Okay, so there's some things to think about there. There's a lot of questions. There's a lot more questions than there are answers. Humans evolved from apes or monkeys. Wrong. Apes and monkeys evolved, and humans evolved, and we have common ancestry. Monkeys are monkeys and apes are apes, and humans are humans, and we have some common ancestry, but those ancestors are nowhere to be found now. They are not part of our current ecosystem. Evolution is part of nature's grand plan to produce perfectly adapted species. Perfectly adapted to what? We are adapted to our ecosystems. That is how it works. Evolution by natural selection is not important because it's just a theory. No. Everything everything is key to change, and that is what we're studying. We're studying change over time. 4.5, what factors affect biodiversity? New species are going to arise in 2 phases, and we really saw this in the Anoles lab. Geographic isolation will allow for 2 populations to be separated, and they're no longer going to be sharing genetic information. So as changes happen in this species over here, those changes are not being translated into this population. So geographic isolation is a really key component of seeing new species, or what we call speciation. Populations migrate or are separated by some other cause. It can be there can be a lot of things, or it may be over time, even just the resource partitioning, as opposed to like it might be like geographic isolation or behavioral isolation that happens because of that resource partitioning. So it's still isolation now. And then reproductive isolation means that a mutation or change by natural selection occurs within these groups that have been spatially isolated, and then eventually, whatever it is, like if those groups were to come back together, they wouldn't breed. Okay, now this we have a lot of contention over speciation and whether something is actually a species. So I want you to pause this, and I want you to look up a Pizzly bear or a growler, Grolar. It is the hybrid of a grizzly and a polar bear. Now, grizzly bears and polar bears are absolutely 2 different species, but they can interbreed, and their offspring can produce viable offspring, which technically would mean that they are the same species. However, we do not consider them the same species. Even though they can produce viable offspring, it doesn't mean that that offspring is fit for any particular environment yet. we honestly might be seeing uh, how a species would um, be reintroduced because because of ecological pressure. So as humans have interrupted the habitat needs of both of these bear species, and we have some really interesting things happening. So uh, it doesn't necessarily fit the tight definition of species. So just so you know, this is like there's like the technical definition, and then there's like the practical definition and how it is applied. Here's another example, very much like the grizzly and the polar bear. Okay, the Arctic fox and the gray fox, different environmental conditions have led to different selective pressures, and totally two different species exist. There's the northern population and the southern population of foxes. The Arctic fox is adapted to the cold, it has heavier fur, shorter ears, short legs, short nose, white fur that will match the snow, especially during the winter, and they actually have like coat color changes. Whereas the gray fox is adapted to heat, has lightweight fur, long ears, long legs, longer nose, and it allows for their body heat to be regulated. Now, if those two populations ever came back together, would they breed? I don't know, but they don't. And so we do consider them to be species. Just because of that geographic isolation, they're two different species. So there's a technical definition, and then there's the practical definition as well. In your book, in this Science Focus 4.2, there is some fundamental understanding that has to do with tectonic plates and how plate movement affects evolution and the distribution of life on Earth. And so I want you to be familiar with this idea that what tectonic plates are, and that the location of continents have shifted over time, and the oceans have shifted over time through geologic time, which is what we call like deep time. It's been long periods of time. We don't mark those in decades or even centuries or even millennium. Those are marked kind of in varying amounts of years according to whatever the climate and conditions were at the time. And we'll go over geologic time. I'm going to give you a handout. We'll kind of go over what some of the names are, epochs and eons, and like how this works. Species within those time periods were very different, and the ecology of the Earth was very different. Species have adapted and moved into new environments slowly, and this has allowed for speciation. So the world as we know it now, Earth as we know it now, is not what it was millions of years ago. It's absolutely completely different. Earthquakes can separate and isolate populations. Volcanic eruptions can destroy habitats. We just saw an example of this. Here's an example. You've probably heard of Pangaea, and Pangaea was a supercontinent. 225 million years ago, we see evidence in the fossil layers, we see evidence in mountain ranges, and we see evidence in current plate movement if we run it backwards. And we also see evidence in the shapes of continents, where these are the changes that have happened over time. There's more too in terms of like magneticism and some of the new rock that's being formed, and where old rock is recycled. And then we can even look at density differences and temperature differences that are deeper in the Earth. And we can see evidence of like large continents that have been melting or have been pulled under continents, and they're cooler, and there's a lot of evidence for the movement of continents over time. And so one supercontinent arrangement that's very famous was called Pangaea, and you could see that organisms could migrate, so there could be shared genetics because there was less geographic isolation than there is now. We do have to talk about artificial selection, because a lot of times it's easy for us to think about like what we are familiar with. We are familiar with selective breeding or crossbreeding. If you know anything about dogs, you know dogs are all the same species, but they have a wide variety of traits. And you can see those traits show up. And we, as humans, have kind of pushed dogs into certain categories. Not that they were naturally meant for that, but we've used those traits to serve us Like we have hunting dogs, and we have search and rescue dogs, and we have shepherds, and all these different types of dogs that we've chosen the genetic traits that we wanted to see. So humans and dogs have evolved together, and dogs are a really important part of our culture. And we have used these animals over time, and their genetics have responded to our selective breeding, and that's artificial selection. It is not speciation, and it's a very slow process, but we have seen it both in the natural and then kind of like in our really like science-driven world as well. Genetic engineering is a way to speed the process of artificial selection by introducing segments of gene from one organism into another, or from one, of the same species into that species. But we like to actually take genes and splice them. Like there are some famous ones, but we've taken jellyfish genes from jellyfish that glow, and we put them in cats. Pretty crazy. You could look that up too. The steps in genetic engineering, not that they're super important, but you understand that we're dealing with DNA here. It may be something to kind of like peruse a little on yourself. Identify a gene with the desired trait from DNA from some donor organism. You got to extract that DNA from a bacterial cell, insert the desired gene into a plasmid to form a recombinant DNA. So we can take chunks. I mean, it's all the same materials that are being used, but they form different proteins, and those different proteins form different organisms. If we get down to the root of it, everyone's DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. It has a phosphate and backbone, and we have all of the same nucleotides that are making up the deoxyribonucleic acid. Your DNA on a molecular level is not different from a bacteria's DNA on a molecular level. It's the sequences that are different. And so we can kind of plug and play, if you will, genes. And we've learned to control this because bacteria do have a capacity to like ingest and integrate segments of DNA into their own genome, and we kind of play with this in the lab. Pretty crazy stuff. And then we can transfer that genetically modified bacteria back into a plant or animal, and you can get then the animal or the plant will pick up this new gene, and you get a genetically modified organism. So it's synthetic, definitely synthetic. And we've learned to basically use bacteria as a tool for replicating particular genes and then inserting those particular genes from one organism to another. Pretty nutty. Synthetic biology is where we use segments of DNA to design and create artificial cells, tissues, or body parts of organisms that are not even found in nature. And so this is part of, what we have learned to do in the lab and how we've learned to control these really incredible processes. A lot of people are afraid of genetic modification. There are, I would have to say it's fascinating, but there are definitely consequences that go along with this that sometimes we don't really think about. So this is just an example of crossbreeding. Pear and apple crossbreeding. They wouldn't normally create a hybrid, but we can use synthetic biology. We can like take the sperm of one organism and we can artificially use it to fertilize the egg in another organism, and we can use hormones to stop any process that would like inhibit that from happening. So we can do some really cool hybrid stuff, but it's not necessarily natural. And yes, like I said, there are unintended consequences, and we do need to be careful. So it's something that's very intriguing, but there are consequences to it. Okay, so just as we see like evolution will lead to speciation, we don't have just a growing number of species at the same rate, basically, because we have a finite set of resources. So a finite set of resources means that we can't just have endless species showing up on Earth, right? So in the same way that there is a speciation process, there is an extinction process that is natural. Extinction is a process which um, is going to mean that as organisms um, shift over time, like you're not going to see that organism anymore. And if it's happening slowly, you don't necessarily define it as like it's not a mass extinction. It's just that that organism is no longer the current state of whatever it has become over time. Like I said when I was talking about like common ancestors for apes and monkeys, it is um, what we refer to as background extinction. It's typically a very, very low rate of extinction, and we see one, it's like 1 in a million species that would go extinct in a natural background extinction rate. Now, humans, we've sped that up. A species that is only found in one area is called an endemic species. That means not only is it native, but it's unique to that particular ecosystem. It's endemic. We have yellow-billed magpies in the Sacramento Valley. They are endemic to the Sacramento Valley. You don't find them anywhere else. If they go extinct here, they go extinct. A mass extinction is different from background extinction because this is like a significant event. Oftentimes, we look at some kind of huge natural disaster, asteroid impact, or a large volcanic eruption, where this the fallout from that changes the ecosystem so quickly, so drastically, that many species are not able to survive. So this can be anywhere from 20 to even 95% of the species that get eliminated because of some event where you have this massive die off. And this produces a space in ecosystems for new species to proliferate and to fill in. So this is like when we see the age, like the age of the dinosaurs ends, and you get mammals. Mammals would not have taken over the earth if dinosaurs were still dominating. So there had to have been a mass extinction event first, gives up ecological real estate, and then organisms move in. And then this last thing we are going to spend some time talking about, and like I said, I'm going to give you a handout for it, but this is a diagram of geologic time. And so you can see, I want you to take a look at that middle column, million years ago. Today, we start there, okay? We are in the Cenozoic era, in the Quaternary period, and there is some, like, discussion of naming the new period, the Anthropocene. Like we're going to have a new name because we actually will make a mark on the earth in terms of like how much development, technology, and changing we have done to the face of the earth as humans. And you can see that we are currently in an extinction crisis. Many species are expected to become extinct within the next 50 to 100 years. And so that's why really like they're talking about naming this, the Anthropocene, naming this time period. So as you move down, you can see tertiary period, and then we go into the Mesozoic era, the Cretaceous period, Jurassic, Triassic, Permian, Carboniferous, Devonian. Each of those are particular ecosystems on Earth that are very unique, and they had a whole set of organisms and traits. Like some of those ecosystems we don't even like they're just not even part of our reality now. They're alien world completely. And then in the blue bar, you can see mass extinctions. So there's been 5 mass extinctions: Ordovician, Devonian. Oh, I'm reading up from the bottom: Ordovician, Devonian, Permian, Triassic, and Cretaceous. And then currently, our current extinction event that is happening that has been pushed along even further. May have been happening naturally already, but now it's been pushed along further, faster by humans. And I think that that's the last slide. Oh, nope. Okay. When the environment changes rapidly, species only have three options. You can adapt, migrate, or go extinct, right? So adapt, that has to happen quickly if the environment is changing quickly. Migrate, move, or go extinct. If you can't move, like if you're a tree, you're rooted, how do you move? Obviously, that they can shift, but it takes time. Polar bears reproduce slowly, but environmental conditions they depend on for survival are changing very quickly. It puts a massive amount of pressure on an organism to shift. So we're going to see a lot of our large organisms that have a narrow niche. They are the ones that are going to be the most threatened. All right, so that's it for chapter 4, and that's your notes. Hopefully it's not too long. We'll see.